Hey everyone, in this quick Phaser tutorial video, I'm going to show you how to pass a texture to a custom shader pipeline in Phaser 3. This opens up a ton of creative possibilities, from noise-based effects to distortion, glitch, fog, or even custom transition mask. For this example, we're going to take a noise texture and blend it with our scene renderer, giving us a grainy static-like overlay. In this video, we won't be doing a deep dive into getting started with shaders in Phaser 3, but if you're interested in learning more, I have a few videos on my channel that I recommend checking out. There'll be links on the screen now, as well as links down in the description to these two videos here. In the first video, we covered WebGL and shaders, and how we can create these shaders in Phaser 3. In the second video, we take a look at how we can create some of the classic Pokemon battle scene transitions by using shaders. If you'd like to follow along with this video, there'll be links in the project description to the starting source code for this project. So in the starting project template, I've already got a basic scene running in Phaser 3, and we set up a custom pipeline that applies a full screen shader. For our pipeline, all we're doing is just rendering out the original pixels that are passed to the shader. So in the project code, if we open up our Phaser scene, all we're doing is we're loading in the two assets that we'll be using for our project. In our create method, we're rendering out our background image, and then we're creating an instance of our custom pipeline. We then have a custom integration with TweakPane, which allows us to modify some of our properties on the fly for our pipeline. So if we open up our noise post FX pipeline, this is just a custom shader that's extending our Phaser renderer WebGL pipelines and our post FX pipeline. So for our pipeline, we're referencing this fragment shader up here, and all we're doing is just rendering out the original pixel from the texture that's passed in. We have a few custom variables that we've defined, this uScale and uBlend, and those are tied to our pipeline here, and where we set those values on our onPreRender method. And so this just allows us to modify those two properties on the fly in our Phaser scene class, and then when our pipeline runs, we can use those dynamic values in our code. Currently they're not being used, but we'll use them in our example in just a second. And so if we run our project code, we should see our background image with TweakPane, and if we modify our values, nothing happens, since our shader is just rendering out our original pixel. So now for our custom pipeline, if we want to be able to pass a custom texture to our shader so we can mix it with our original image here, we need to update our fragment shader to allow us to pass an additional variable. Currently our shader is set up to only expect one texture, and that's going to be this uniform sampler 2D, this uMain sampler here. This uMain sampler, this is our main texture of what we're rendering out currently in our game. To pass a secondary texture, we need to add a new uniform to our code. So we'll do a uniform, a sampler 2D. We're going to call this uNoise. And so now that we have this new texture, we're going to update our code down here to no longer reference our uMain sampler. Instead, we're going to reference our uNoise texture. So now that we've updated our fragment shader to expect our new texture, we need to update our pipeline to set this variable in our fragment shader. To do this, there's a few things we need to do in our code. So we're going to focus on getting our pipeline updated to pass our texture, and then we'll come back and explain what we did. The first thing we need to make sure we do is whatever texture we want to use, we want to make sure that this is loaded and available in our texture manager in Phaser. So in our Phaser scene, in our preload method, we're already loading in our noise PNG file here that we're going to pass as our secondary texture. So now in our custom pipeline, we first need to get a reference to that texture from our textures manager. So we come down to the bottom of our code. First, we're going to add in the onBoot method. For this method, we're not going to return anything. And now we're going to reference our gradient texture property that's in our class. We're going to do this. We're going to do our game to reference our Phaser game instance. We'll do textures to reference our textures manager. Now we're going to do getFrame. And now we're going to pass in our asset key of our texture that we want to grab from our texture manager. Finally, we're going to reference our GL texture property on that texture. Now that we have a reference to our texture from our texture manager, we need to pass this to our fragment shader. First, in our onPreRender method, we need to set our uNoise variable here in our fragment shader. To do that, we're going to do this. We're going to do set1i, and this allows us to set a uniform integer, and for that, we're going to do uNoise, and we'll pass in 1. Next, we need to add our onDraw method, and in this method, we're going to receive one argument, and this is going to be our render target. This is going to be our Phaser, our renderer, our WebGL, and our render target. Now in this method, we want to do this, bind texture. We're going to reference our gradient texture property, and then we'll pass in 1 for our unit, and now we'll do this, .bind and draw. We want to pass in our render target. So now if we save, if we come back over to our browser, we should see that our scene's been updated to just display our noise texture that we passed in. So now if we come back up to our fragment shader, instead of referencing uNoise, if we revert this back to uMainSampler and we save and we come back, we'll display our original image in our game. So now what we did here is, in our post-effects pipeline, Phaser allows us to pass additional textures to our fragment shader. How this works is we need to tell WebGL what texture we want to use, and we need to bind it to what's called a texture unit. To bind our texture to our texture unit, that's what we did down here in our onPreRender method. So here we set an integer uniform, and we picked one of our texture channels. So for this, we referenced our uNoise variable, which is our sampler 2D here for our custom texture. So instead of passing in our texture here, we need to pick a place where we're going to store that texture at. And so this is our unit value here, which we're calling 1. And so how this works is anytime we want to pass an additional texture to our fragment shader, we first need to bind it to one of our texture slots in WebGL. And so these texture slots, these are just integers, and by default, our integer 0, so slot 0, that's always going to be our uMainSampler here, which is the original texture that we're rendering out. So for our texture, we just went to the next available slot, which is slot 1, and here, by calling bind texture, and that's where we bound our texture for our noise image to that texture slot. And so by us storing it in slot 1, we just need to make sure our uNoise property, our custom variable we set up here, references that same texture slot. So one important thing we did here is when we call bind texture, we called this method from our onDraw method here. This is important because our onDraw method is called right before our shader actually runs. So this is the last step before our shader executes, and by us binding our texture here, it guarantees that our gradient texture is bound to our correct texture unit when our shader actually takes a sample from it. If we did this on our onPreRender method, this would be too early in our pipeline. What could happen is other pipelines or our internal Phaser operations, they're going to run between our onPreRender and the actual draw from our pipeline. What this means is our texture, it could get replaced by something else before our shader actually runs. By making this call here, it makes sure that this texture is available for us in this specific fragment shader. Finally, we called the bind and draw method, and we passed the original render target that's passed to our onDraw method. And so this is important because it's going to set up our shader with all of our correct uniforms and our textures, and then allows us to draw to our scene using this fragment shader. So now that our fragment shader has access to this new texture, we're going to add code to blend this texture with our original image in our game. To do that, we need to mix our two textures together. First, we're going to get a reference to our original texture. So we're going to add a new variable, do a vec4. We're going to call this base. We're going to set equal to our texture 2D. Now we're going to reference to our original texture. So we'll do our uMainSampler. We want our out text coordinate. Now we want to get a reference to our custom texture. So do vec4. We'll call this noise. And we're going to set equal to this line of code here. And so now that we have our two references, we can use our built-in mix function to mix these two textures together. So we're going to do our glFragColor. We're going to use our mix function, and now we're going to take our base, and we're going to mix it with our noise. And now for our blend amount, we're going to do 0.5. And now if we save, if we come back to our game, we should see now we have our two textures blended together. So our mix function here, if we set this to our lower value for the blend amount, it's going to blend less of our texture into our original texture here. Another thing we can do is if we multiply our out text coordinate by some value, this will allow us to have our texture repeat, which will give us a finer grain on our noise. So as an example, let's make this 0.9 so it really stands out. And now if we times this by 1.0, our original value, we're going to see our texture, our pixels are very big. But now if we multiply this by 2.0, we'll see our pixels get smaller. And now if we multiply something by like 8.0, now we'll see our texture repeats multiple times and our grains are much smaller. So now the last thing we're going to do is we're just going to hook up our other two custom variables for these two values. So instead of doing a hard-coded value here, we're going to reference our uScale variable, and then down here, we're going to reference our uBlend variable. So now if we save, if we come back over to our game, now we should see our original image with a little bit of grain added to our game. And now if we modify our values, we can see our texture gets updated in real time. As you can see, this adds a subtle noise overlay to our entire screen. It's great for grain effects, glitch transitions, or just adding a little texture to your visuals. And that's how you pass a texture into a custom shader in Phaser 3. Once you have this set up, you can try swapping in other textures like scanlines, static, or even pattern mask for different effects. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and drop a comment with any shader ideas or effects you'd like to see next. And if you've been digging these Phaser tutorials and want to support the channel, I've set up a Ko-fi page. Even a one-time Ko-fi helps me keep making more videos like this. You'll find a link in the description. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.